Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking, well, a really high-stakes look into South Korea's economic future. We've got source material, pretty much hot off the press, showing a nation trying one of the most complex economic pivots in its history.
Yeah, it really feels like that. This seems to be the moment the government is going all in on AI.
Exactly. And at the same time, forcing this, like, painful reckoning in traditional heavy industries.
Mm.
And all this is happening while the domestic stock market is just, surging to this high leverage frenzy.
It really is an inflection point, I think. And for you, the listener, understanding the depth of this policy shift is really key to interpreting these dramatic market movements we're seeing. The government's committing historic resources. I mean, we're talking about a budget the president himself is calling the first of the AI era.
Right.
But, that commitment, it demands sacrifice from the established sectors.
So the central question for this deep dive, I guess, is whether Seoul can actually pull off this structural transition without maybe triggering a severe collapse in the existing economic framework. We're going to try and connect three critical areas today. First, that huge new national budget dedicated to the AI vision.
Okay.
Second, the surgical and sometimes pretty brutal industrial restructuring reforms, especially around finance and heavy industry.
Right, the tough stuff.
And finally, the high-octane, debt-fueled reaction we're seeing from retail investors in the KOSPI market.
And these threads are completely interwoven, aren't they? The market euphoria is directly linked to the promises and the policy.
For sure.
But the risk, the volatility, it's amplified by just the sheer speed and scale of the change being mandated. So where should we start? Maybe with the grand vision, the big numbers.
Yeah, let's unpack this budget first. So the president recently unveiled the upcoming year's government budget. And the number itself, it just immediately signals urgency. 728 trillion KRW.
Yep.
Yeah. That represents an 8.1% increase from the current year's main budget. I mean, that's one of the most aggressive spending plans in recent memory.
Okay, 728 trillion KRW. Just to give listeners a sense, what's that globally?
Right. Good point. We're talking about roughly $530 billion USD. It's a massive commitment for an economy of South Korea's scale.
That number itself is jarring, yeah. But what's maybe most fascinating is the political framing around it.
How so?
Well, the president didn't just call it a budget. He framed it as like a national survival mechanism. He explicitly called it the first budget of the AI era, saying the nation is facing a crisis, due to geopolitics and the speed of AI transformation.
So it's not optional spending in their view.
No, not at all. It's seen as absolutely necessary for survival.
And the sources, they really highlighted the historical weight being put on this push, didn't they? Comparing it to, like, foundational projects in the past.
Absolutely. The analogy they used is incredibly strong, and it resonates, deeply within South Korea's history of rapid development. They're drawing a direct line from President Park Chung-hee, who oversaw the industrial highways, the export boom.
Right, the Gyeongbu Expressway.
Oh, exactly, to Kim Dae-jung, who laid down the information highways, making the nation a global IT leader.
Okay.
And now the goal is to build the AI high-speed road. So this tells us this AI initiative isn't just some temporary program. It's seen as like the next generation's half-century national mission.
So if that's the high-speed road, what are the specifics? The investment details for construction. They've allocated a specific massive chunk of funding, 10.1 trillion KRW, towards that AI3 major powers status goal. Where is that money actually going?
It seems highly targeted. There's a split. About 2.6 trillion KRW is aimed at immediate, broad AI adoption. Getting AI tools into existing industries, public services, daily life. That's integration.
For the practical stuff.
Right. But the majority, 7.5 trillion KRW, that's dedicated more to the supply side. Fostering talent, training engineers, building out the physical infrastructure, data centers, power supply, networks, everything you need for an AI-centric economy.
And beyond that initial 10.1 trillion, there's also a separate longer-term commitment mentioned. Suggests this isn't just a one-year plan.
Correct. Yeah, the sources detail another 6 trillion KRW committed over the next 5 years. And that's specifically for the rapid AI transition across major industrial fields. So deep, structural, long-term funding. It ensures AI isn't just a separate tech sector, but more like the foundational operating system for, well, the entire national industry.
We should probably briefly note, too, this high-tech focus extends to defense. The budget includes an 8.2% increase there, 66.3 trillion KRW total, aiming to be a four major defense powerhouse. It just underlines that the strategic thinking is, the next leap in security and economic power is tied directly to advanced tech.
Indeed. It's a strategic calculation, really driven by needing to survive and lead in what feels like an increasingly unstable global environment. However, as the reports immediately pointed out, this grand plan, it's already hitting political headwinds.
Ah, right. That's the tension. The main opposition party actually boycotted the policy speech entirely, protesting some recent judicial actions. So what does this political standoff mean for the budget itself?
Well, it means legislative passage isn't guaranteed, not by a long shot. It'll likely involve significant political maneuvering, maybe some dilution of the plans. The enthusiasm for this massive AI investment, which the government sees as essential, it's hitting that hard wall of partisan politics right away.
Which makes the next part, the restructuring, even trickier.
Exactly. That volatility makes it all the more delicate.
Okay, let's transition then from the budget to maybe the painful policy parts. Grand visions usually mean dismantling some of the old stuff. We need to talk about two big areas of reform, starting with that regulatory challenge. Kiamsan-Bowlri.
Ah, yes. Kiamsan-Bowlri. The separation of financial and industrial capital. It's foundational policy, really, put in place largely after the 97-98 financial crisis.
Right, to stop the big conglomerates, the chaebol, from having too much power over banks.
Exactly. It prevents them wielding excessive influence over financial firms. It's been seen as a critical guardrail against, concentrated economic power and potential abuse.
But the sources suggest that, for the sake of AI investment, the government is thinking about bending this rule. That sounds, pretty fundamental, potentially risky.
It is a pivotal shift, no doubt. And that's probably why the presidential chief of staff, Kim Young-bum, was quick to clarify their approach. They're saying they are not relaxing Kiamsan-Bowlri broadly.
Okay.
If they did that, it would definitely be seen as returning to pre-crisis risks. Instead, the plan is to use special legislation, very targeted, only for cutting-edge, high-risk, high-reward sectors like semiconductors and maybe biotechnology.
So why this specific narrow focus? Why risk relaxing such a core regulation just for these sectors?
Because the need for massive, consolidated investment is seen as really acute and immediate. They mentioned needing to support domestic partners in things like that new OpenAI, Samsung, SK Hynix collaboration.
Ah, right.
The government seems to recognize that if they want these domestic giants to compete with the kind of capital and support offered by the U.S. or China, the support they provide has to be, in their words, of a different dimension. That includes things like guaranteed power and infrastructure.
So they're betting the national urgency outweighs the historical risk, but only in these key AI-related areas.
Seems to be the calculation, yes, but only in areas driving AI supremacy.
Okay, so accelerated support and regulatory flexibility for the future economy. Now let's talk about the traditional sectors being forced to evolve, maybe even contract. This is where the pain is really felt, I imagine. The government introduced this Steel Industry Advancement Plan.
Yeah, this is basically mandatory evolution, pure and simple. The government's directly intervening in the supply chain, trying to force a cleanup of globally oversupplied products. They're targeting low-value stuff, like rebar and common steel, for mandatory capacity reduction. It'll be done through, supposedly, voluntary agreements with companies.
Wait, so the government is effectively deciding which product lines should stop. Doesn't that risk, overreach? Almost like centralized planning?
It does carry that risk, absolutely. But the government's perspective seems to be that these products are just drowning in global oversupply, mostly from China, making them long-term liabilities. They argue the national interest demands the industry pivot immediately to high-value goods. And importantly, they're backing that mandate with a pretty substantial financial carrot.
Okay, let's talk about that carrot, because it sounds significant, to counteract the contraction side.
Exactly. To ease the pain of downsizing, they're committing significant resources. A total package of around 770 billion KRW that includes 200 billion for crucial R&D and 570 billion in financial support for advanced products, like special carbon steel. The goal is ambitious. World #1 technology by 2030 in 5 key high-value items. It's a classic industrial policy move, really. Force the clean out at the bottom, heavily subsidize the top end.
And that sense of urgency, it seems to apply across the board for traditional sectors. Deputy Prime Minister Koo Yoon-kyo gave a very pointed warning to the petrochemical sector too, right?
Yeah.
Which also faces huge global competition.
He was remarkably blunt. based on the reports. The source is, quote, him stressing that the industry must not waste the golden time for self-reform. I mean, that's not a suggestion. It sounds like a threat.
Yeah, it does.
He made it pretty clear that if the petrochemical sector doesn't proactively undertake deep reforms itself, the government is ready to move beyond just being a helper. They might take more proactive, maybe mandatory restructuring action.
Wow. Okay. Before we jump to the market reaction, just a quick mention on housing, that issue that always gets public attention.
Right.
The government acknowledged price increases are likely unavoidable as the economy recovers. And the countermeasure is launching this housing supply expansion ministerial meeting this month, trying to address supply issues.
A small but probably politically necessary acknowledgement.
Definitely.
Necessary, maybe, but perhaps overshadowed by the sheer spectacle in the market right now. Let's shift gears to where all this policy ambition and structural pain is colliding with the retail investor. The recent market data is just, well, astonishing.
Yeah, here's where that high-speed analogy really kicks in. We're seeing this startling reversal in investor behavior. For the first time in a whole year, it's a domestic ETF tracking the KOSPI, the Codex 200. It's actually surpassed the net asset value of the big U.S. S&P 500 ETF, the Tiger U.S. S&P 500.
Right.
Yeah. The domestic fund now holds 11.144 trillion KRW compared to the U.S. fund's 10.871 trillion. The retail investors, the ants as they're called, they are aggressively rotating their money back home.
That pivot is incredibly significant. Wow. It signals that the kind of year-long fever for investing in the U.S. market has broken.
Seems like it.
And it's been replaced by this explosive confidence in the domestic market's potential, fueled by the government's big AI push. And I guess the performance justifies it. So far, anyway. Teos PI up, 71.8% year to date, world's top performer.
Exactly. And the Codex 200 ETF itself returned an incredible 86.42% year to date.
Staggering number.
But that kind of return, it isn't just general optimism, right? What are the core factors really driving this massive surge?
Well, it seems to boil down to a kind of three-part structural story. First, absolutely, the AI semiconductor boom, specifically the massive demand for high bandwidth memory, HBM. That alone drove SK Hynix stock up over 240% this year. Second, those government capital market activation policies trying to incentivize domestic investment. And third, the external environment. Expected dollar weakness, U.S. interest rate cuts possibly coming. That pushes capital back towards emerging markets, and South Korea seems to be the prime beneficiary of that flow right now.
But this market euphoria, it's starting to look profoundly risky, doesn't it? Especially when you look at the leverage involved with the ant movement. Retail investors bought 4.5 trillion KRW in KSPI in just 7 trading days. Where does the debt component fit in?
Yes. That's where the systemic risk climbs dramatically. We have to look at that metric known locally as B2. Basically, debt fuel investment margin loans, leverage.
Okay.
These credit margin loans have soared to 25.46 trillion KRW. That puts the market perilously close to the all-time record set back during the peak pandemic euphoria in 2021.
25 trillion KRW in leveraged retail investment. I mean, historically, when leverage gets that high, hasn't the correction usually been brutal? Are experts sounding the alarm? Is there talk of systemic danger?
Oh yeah, there are significant cautionary quotes in the sources. Experts warning about potential steep, maybe immediate corrections because of this rapid rise in the extreme debt load. The worry is, any external shock could trigger a nasty cycle of margin calls.
But the authorities seem almost lenient.
That's the surprising part. Yeah, the Financial Services Commission vice chairman apparently suggested that Boot 2 shouldn't be viewed too negatively, arguing it's just a form of leverage used in a bullish market.
That gives me pause. Is the government maybe underestimating how fragile a debt-fueled surge can be?
It suggests a very optimistic calculation on their part, believing maybe that the structural shift, the genuine AI boom, can absorb this risk. But the market itself offered an immediate counter-warning, didn't it?
How so?
On the very day trading volume peaked recently, the KOSPI dropped 2.37%. That was the largest single-day drop since late September. Yeah. That volatility just underscores how fragile this debt-laden foundation might be. So the government's betting on structural growth, but retail investors are basically betting the farm on immediate continued success.
What a high-wire act indeed. South Korea is simultaneously committing to this massive AI budget, enforcing painful structural reforms across finance, heavy industry, all while navigating a market that reflects spectacular optimism, but one built on a foundation of record-high investor leverage.
It is the very essence of a forced inflection point, I think. We've covered the 728 trillion KRW AI budget, that groundbreaking regulatory shift with Kamsan-Boulri for advanced sectors,
Right.
the mandatory contraction facing steel, and this highly volatile retail investment frenzy fueled by, what was it, 25 trillion KRW in Beat 2, enough to push the Codex 200 past its U.S. counterpart.
So the ultimate question for you, the listener, is whether this massive injection of capital and reform can stabilize the economy before the high leverage baked into the market inevitably triggers some kind of correction. We'll definitely be watching closely as this AI-era budget meets political reality.
We appreciate you sharing this fascinating source material with us. It's certainly a situation to keep an eye on. We'll continue to track these developments.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.